April 11th, 1945. The smell of diesel and gunpowder hangs over the Elbe River like a curtain that won't fall. Patton's jeep stops at the riverbank. He steps out. He looks east. The river is 300 meters wide, fast, cold, crossable. Berlin is 80 kilometers beyond it. 80 kilometers. In the Third Army's terms, 3 days, maybe 4. Patton has covered more ground in less time against stiffer resistance. He knows this. His staff knows this. His tank commanders know this. They are ready. And then the field telephone rings. Patton's aide, Major Alexander Stiller, answers it. He listens for 14 seconds. He turns to Patton with an expression that every soldier recognizes. The expression of a man delivering news he did not choose. The order is from SAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower's headquarters. The advance stops at the Elbe. Berlin is not an American objective. Patton takes the field phone. He listens to the confirmation. He does not shout. He does not throw the phone into the river, though witnesses would later say the restraint was visible on his face as a physical effort. He hands the phone back to Stiller. He turns east again. He stares at the far bank for a long time. Then he says something that nobody in his inner circle forgot, and that nobody wrote down until years later, and that when they finally wrote it down, they could not agree on the exact words, only on what the words meant. He said, "We will pay for this. Not today, not next year. We will pay for this for a generation." He was right. It took 40 years and the collapse of the Soviet Union for the world to understand precisely how right he was. This is that story. To understand what Patton saw standing at the Elbe, you have to understand what the war looked like in April 1945 from inside a Third Army jeep. The Third Army had been fighting continuously since August 1944. They had broken out of Normandy at Avranches. They had raced across France. They had pivoted 90 degrees in 72 hours to relieve Bastogne. They had crossed the Moselle, the Saar, the Rhine. Each crossing was supposed to be impossible. None of them were. By April 1945, Patton's army had advanced further, faster, against more determined resistance, with fewer non-battle casualties than any comparable American formation in the European theater. This was not accident, it was method. It was Patton's method. And the method had brought them here. To a river, to a road sign, to 80 kilometers of open terrain between the Third Army and the capital of the Third Reich. Patton's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Oskar Koch, had been tracking Soviet positions since late March. Koch was meticulous. He was the man who had predicted the German Ardennes offensive 3 days before it happened, when every other Allied intelligence officer was telling Eisenhower the sector was quiet. Koch's predictions had a record. What Koch was telling Patton in early April 1945 was simple and alarming. The Soviet forces driving for Berlin from the east were not moving as fast as American forces from the west. Their supply lines were extended. Their logistics were strained after the brutal winter offensive. Their casualties in the Vistula-Oder campaign had been enormous. Koch's estimate, delivered verbally to Patton on April 8th, was that a rapid American advance to Berlin could reach the city before Soviet forces. Not certainly, but plausibly. Patton did not need a certain outcome. He needed a plausible one. He went to Bradley. General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, which included Patton's Third Army. Bradley was a competent, careful, methodical commander. He and Patton had known each other for decades. They had served together, argued together, covered for each other in the political firefights that accompanied every senior command. Bradley liked Patton. He trusted his instincts in the field. But Bradley lived in a different world than Patton. Bradley lived in the world of SHAEF, of combined Allied planning, of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin, Of the agreements made at Yalta in February 1945, agreements that Patton had not attended and had read with the specific contempt of a man who believed diplomats cost soldiers their lives. At Yalta, the Allied leaders had agreed on occupation zones. Germany would be divided. Berlin would fall inside the Soviet zone of occupation. Patton's argument against stopping at the Elbe rested on a distinction that he found obvious, and that the political architecture of 1945 found irrelevant. The Yalta agreements described occupation zones for after the war. They said nothing explicit about who had to get to Berlin first. Get there first, Patton argued, and the negotiation changes. Hold at the Elbe, and you hand the Soviets Berlin as a gift. Patton made this argument to Bradley on April 9, 1945. He made it with charts. He made it with Koch's intelligence assessment. He made it with operational plans that his staff had prepared in the preceding week. Routes mapped, fuel requirements calculated, artillery support coordinated, bridge sites identified on the Mulde and the Elbe, both. Bradley listened. Bradley told him it was not his decision. He forwarded the request to Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower in April 1945 was carrying a weight that Patton, for all his brilliance, genuinely did not fully account for. Eisenhower was not commanding armies. He was managing an alliance. The alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was the political scaffolding that held the entire Allied war effort together. It was fragile. It had been fragile since 1941, and in April 1945, with the German government collapsing and the post-war world beginning to take shape, keeping it intact was Eisenhower's primary strategic objective. There were also military arguments against a Berlin drive that had nothing to do with politics. The National Redoubt. American intelligence in March and April 1945 was reporting the possible existence of a Nazi last stand in the Austrian and Bavarian Alps, an Alpine fortress where SS units, loyal fanatics, and the surviving Nazi leadership might retreat and conduct a guerrilla war for years. The reports were largely exaggerated. In hindsight, they were almost entirely wrong. But at the time, Eisenhower had to take them seriously. A protracted Nazi resistance in the Alps was potentially more dangerous than a race to Berlin that violated the alliance framework. And then there was the casualty calculation. Chafe's operational planners estimated that taking Berlin in a contested urban battle against German defenders, with Soviet forces potentially arriving simultaneously, and the risk of friendly fire between Allied armies adding to the confusion, could cost between 100,000 and 150,000 American casualties. 100,000 men. Eisenhower had been responsible for those men since 1942. He was not going to spend 100,000 of them on a city that the Yalta agreements had already assigned to Soviet occupation. His letter to Soviet Marshal Zhukov, sent through official channels on April 28th, confirmed that American forces would halt at the Elbe and at a line in northern Germany. Patton received confirmation of the final order on April 14th. He wrote in his diary that night, "We have had a chance to win this peace, and we are giving it away." Patton kept a diary throughout the war. It was a remarkable document, profane, brilliant, occasionally petty, frequently prophetic, and almost entirely uncensored. He knew it would be read eventually. He wrote it anyway. The entries from April and May 1945 are among the most extraordinary passages in any senior commander's wartime record. April 15th, 1945. He writes that the Russian is not an ally. The Russian is a future enemy. He writes that every mile the Soviets take in Europe is a mile that will require blood to recover, and that the politicians in Washington do not appear to understand this, or do not appear to care, which may be the same thing expressed differently. April 22nd, 1945. He writes that he has seen the camps. The liberation of the concentration camps was proceeding across the Western Front, and Patton had visited them. He writes without his usual tonal control. The sentences are shorter than usual. The profanity is gone. He describes what he saw in language that is almost clinical, and then he writes, "A nation that does this does not stop because a war ends. It stops when it is physically incapable of continuing. We have made it physically incapable. Now we are handing half of Europe to a different version of the same thing." May 7th, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. Patton writes, "The war everyone is celebrating ended today. The war that will matter has already begun." He was not celebrating. He was right not to. On May 2nd, 1945, Soviet forces completed the capture of Berlin. The battle had begun April 16th. It lasted 16 days. Soviet casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, numbered approximately 360,000 men. German military and civilian casualties were enormous and difficult to precisely calculate. The city was devastated. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov hoisted the red banner over the Reichstag. In Washington and London, the fall of Berlin was celebrated as the final act of the European War. Patton attended no celebrations that day. What followed Berlin's fall proceeded according to the Yalta framework. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern portions of Austria. These were not temporary arrangements. They were the foundations of what Winston Churchill would call, in a speech at Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, an Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain descended across a continent. East of it, in the Soviet zone, what followed was documented extensively by the populations who lived through it, and by Western intelligence services that watched it happen and could do almost nothing about it. In Poland, the government that had fought alongside the Allies since 1939 was dismantled and replaced with a Soviet-aligned regime. The officers who had led the Polish Home Army, who had risen in Warsaw in 1944 and been abandoned while Soviet forces waited on the eastern bank of the Vistula, were arrested, tried, and executed or imprisoned. In Czechoslovakia, democratic institutions survived briefly until the communist coup of February 1948, when Soviet-backed forces seized control in 72 hours. In Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria, the pattern repeated. The countries that had been liberated from German occupation found themselves under Soviet occupation. This was not what the soldiers who had fought across France and the Low Countries and into Germany had believed they were fighting for. Patton believed it was preventable. He said so, loudly, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen and to many who told him to stop. In May and June 1945, Patton began saying things that crossed the line from strategic opinion to political liability. He told reporters that the difference between the Germans and the Soviets was a matter of degree rather than kind. He told a press conference that the Nazi Party was essentially similar to the Republican and Democratic parties of America, by which he meant that it was a political party like any other, members of which should be permitted to hold civilian positions in the occupation government rather than being automatically excluded. He meant it as a practical administrative point. It landed as something that sounded like Nazi apologia. The statement caused an immediate crisis. Eisenhower, who had been protecting Patton from the consequences of his public statements since Sicily, could not protect him from this one. On October 2nd, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. He gave him the 15th Army instead, a paperwork formation responsible for writing the official history of the war. A commander's role without troops, without tanks, without operational authority. Patton accepted it. He continued writing his private views. He continued saying privately what he had said publicly. On December 9th, 1945, his staff car was involved in a collision near Mannheim, Germany. A truck turned in front of the vehicle. Patton's driver braked, The impact was moderate, the kind that, in most vehicles carrying soldiers, would have produced bruises and a report. Patton was not wearing his seatbelt. He was thrown forward. He suffered a cervical vertebra fracture that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later, on December 21st, 1945. He was 60 years old. He never went home. He had predicted the Cold War before it had a name. He did not live to see it confirmed. For 40 years, the argument about whether Patton was right remained exactly that, an argument. Military historians debated the Berlin question. Some argued that Eisenhower's decision was correct, that the casualties of a contested Berlin assault would have been catastrophic, that the Yalta agreements had to be honored, that the alliance with the Soviets had to be preserved to finish the war in the Pacific. Others argued that Patton's operational assessment was correct, that American forces could have reached Berlin before the Soviets, that the city's symbolic and strategic value would have fundamentally altered the post-war settlement, that the Iron Curtain was not inevitable. The argument was theoretical. The Soviet archives were closed. The internal Soviet documents, the communications between Zhukov and Stalin, the operational reports of the Soviet forces driving for Berlin, the political directives that accompanied the military advance, were sealed. Nobody outside the Soviet system knew precisely how close the race had been. Nobody knew what Stalin had thought about the possibility of American forces reaching Berlin first. Nobody knew what instructions Soviet commanders had been given about how to respond if American and Soviet forces arrived simultaneously. Then the wall came down. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved on December 25, 1991. In the years that followed, Soviet-era archives began to open. Historians, Russian, American, British, German, gained access to documents that had been classified for nearly half a century. What they found about the Berlin operation of April-May 1945 was extraordinary. Stalin had been afraid of exactly what Patton was proposing. The Soviet dictator's communications with Zhukov and with Marshal Ivan Konev, who commanded the First Ukrainian Front, the Soviet formation driving from the south, revealed an obsession with the race to Berlin that bordered on paranoia. Stalin told Zhukov in early April 1945 that he had received intelligence suggesting the Americans were planning to drive for Berlin rapidly. He told Zhukov that the Soviet army must reach Berlin first, regardless of casualties. He told Konev the same thing. He created a competition between his two senior commanders, letting them race each other as well as the Americans, specifically because he feared that Soviet hesitation would give the Americans the city. This was the calculation Patton had been trying to force. Patton had been right that the race was closer than Schaeff believed. He had been right that the Soviets were not certain of reaching Berlin first. He had been right that American speed could have changed the outcome. What the archives also revealed was more disturbing. Stalin's directives to Soviet political officers accompanying the Berlin advance were explicit about what Soviet occupation of the city was intended to produce. This was not a military objective, it was a political one. The Soviet occupation of Berlin was the anchor for Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Control the capital, control the symbolism, control the negotiating position for every subsequent conversation about the post-war order. Patton had understood this with the intuition of a cavalryman who had spent his career studying the relationship between ground and power. You hold the ground gives you everything else. The diplomats had thought about the post-war world in terms of agreements. Patton had thought about it in terms of rivers and roads and who gets there first. The rivers and roads turned out to matter more than the agreements. General Omar Bradley, who had forwarded Patton's request to Eisenhower and received the negative answer, lived until 1981. He gave interviews in his final years that reflected a man wrestling with the choices of 1945. He said in one late-life conversation that the Berlin question was one he had revisited many times, and that the answer had not gotten simpler with distance. He did not say Patton was wrong. He said the situation had been more complicated than any single commander's view could contain. That is probably true. It is also true that the commander whose view proved most accurate was the one who was stopped at the Elbe. 45 years of Cold War. The numbers are almost too large to process as human experience. The Iron Curtain divided families. It divided cities, Berlin itself, cut in half by wire, and then by concrete beginning in August 1961, a city where people died trying to cross 100 meters of controlled ground to reach the other side. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, 36,000 American dead. The Cold War's first hot expression, produced directly by the Soviet-American division of the post-war world. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest to crush a popular uprising. The world watched. The United States, committed by treaty and alliance structure to the Soviet sphere's borders, did nothing. Approximately 2,500 Hungarians died in the fighting. 200,000 fled the country. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 13 days in October when the world stood closer to nuclear war than it has been at any point in the nuclear age. The crisis was a direct product of Soviet-American ideological confrontation, a confrontation rooted in the post-war division of Europe, Vietnam, the proxy wars in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, the nuclear arms race that consumed the wealth of two superpowers for half a century and left both less secure at its end than either had been at its beginning. These were the costs, not all of them attributable to the decision at the Elbe. History does not work with single causes, but the architecture that made all of them possible, the ideological confrontation between Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe and American-aligned Western Europe, had its origin point in April and May of 1945. In the decisions made about who would hold what ground when the shooting stopped. Patton had looked at that architecture in formation and said, "This is going to cost us for a generation." He was wrong only about the duration. It cost us for 2 generations. This is the moment in the story where intellectual honesty requires the counter-argument to be examined directly. Was Eisenhower wrong? The men who defended his decision are not without a case. The casualty estimates for a contested Berlin operation were real. The German garrison of Berlin, Wehrmacht regulars, SS units, and the Volkssturm, the militia of old men and boys that the Nazi regime scraped together in its final months, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Berlin was a modern city with concrete buildings, subway tunnels, and the natural defensive architecture of urban terrain. The Soviet forces that actually took Berlin lost 360,000 men doing it. American forces approaching from the west would not have faced the same opposition. The Germans were not going to fight as hard against Americans as against Soviets, for reasons that anyone who had read any intelligence report about German soldier psychology understood. But even with reduced resistance, the city would have cost lives, significant lives. And then there was the question of what happened when Soviet and American forces met inside a burning city with no clear boundaries, with exhausted and traumatized soldiers on both sides, with communications across language barriers and the fog of urban combat. The friendly fire risk was real. The risk of an incident, a firefight between American and Soviet soldiers caused by confusion or fear or the chaos of a collapsing city, was real. Eisenhower was not an idiot. He was not a coward. He was a supreme commander in the final days of the most destructive war in human history, trying to end it without adding catastrophes to catastrophes. The difference between Eisenhower's view and Patton's was not intelligence or courage. It was time horizon. Eisenhower was managing the immediate, the end of the war, the survival of the alliance, the transition to occupation, the return of the men under his command to their families. Patton was thinking about the next war, not hypothetically, specifically. He had read the Soviet system with the eyes of a man who had studied military history as a scientific discipline for 40 years. And what he read told him that the Soviets would not stop expanding until they were physically stopped. Eisenhower was right about the costs of taking Berlin in April 1945. Patton was right about the costs of not taking it. Both things are true. That is why the Berlin question has not resolved itself into a simple verdict in the 8 decades since the decision was made. It is a tragedy in the precise sense, a situation in which two defensible positions produced an outcome that neither side fully intended. George Patton died in December 1945 without knowing that he would be proven right. He would have been furious about the timing. The archives that confirmed his assessment opened 46 years after his death. The historians who read them and wrote about them were citing the work of a man who had been dead longer than the Cold War had been official. The lesson that's Patton's Berlin argument is not simple. It is not always disobey orders if you think you're right. Patton obeyed the order. He argued against it through every proper channel. He lost the argument. He obeyed. The discipline held even when the decision hurt. And it is not Eisenhower was a fool. He was not. He made a rational decision under conditions of genuine uncertainty with information that was incomplete in ways he could not fully know. The lesson is about what happens when military objectives and political objectives diverge so completely that the men responsible for the military cannot speak clearly to the men responsible for the politics. Patton could see the battlefield. He could not see the Yalta conference room. The politicians at Yalta could see the alliance framework. They could not see what the Third Army's operational map looked like on April 11, 1945, standing on the bank of the Elbe, with 80 kilometers of crossable terrain between them and the city that would define the post-war world. Neither side could fully see what the other saw. And in that gap between what the soldiers knew and what the diplomats agreed to, 45 years of history was made. The principle that this story deposits into the permanent record is not comfortable. Sometimes the man who sees farthest is not the man with the most authority to act on what he sees. Sometimes the right decision is made by people who cannot see the full consequence of making it. And sometimes the cost of those decisions is paid not by the people who made them, but by people who came after, in countries that had different names, in decades that had not yet been lived. Patton stood at the Elbe. He looked east. He knew what was coming. Nobody listened. The Iron Curtain came down. And 40 years later, in archives that had finally been opened, the documents confirmed what the general at the river had seen on a cold April morning in 1945. He had been right. He was too dead to care. But the lesson lived. It lives now. The question it asks is not about war. It asks, when the person with the clearest view of what is coming is the person with the least power to change it, what does an institution owe that person? Not agreement, not automatic deference. Something simpler, a serious answer. History suggests that Patton got everything except that.